Welcome to the official beginning of the Zigmund Reichenbach Show, episode 5. Although I do not mean it in vanity, perhaps it should be called the Zigmund Reichenbach slash CW show or Christian Watson show for my good buddy out there, Mr. Watson from Pensive Politics, here to talk about all the subjects that may have been overlooked or just give you something to look forward to and think about philosophically. Tonight, we will be talking. Go to zigmundreichenbach.com to follow along. But tonight or this afternoon, the show will focus on three primary topics: the big tech scapegoat, politicians, disgust, and great men, and a new fusionism or a new movement to help advance American policies or perhaps even Republican interest, given the failures. And then at the end of the show, we will present Christian with some other topics that he can discuss if he so chooses to join us in doing that. We have Love Thy Neighbor in Public School, the silver lining of the Biden presidency, or equal branches of government, not according to the founders. So we have all those. See if Christian can go hot on those since there are no official articles on that. But that's enough from me. Go ahead, Christian. Give us your introduction, Bob.
Thank you again, Zigmund. I'm Christian Watson. I host the Pensive Politics podcast and the Christian Watson YouTube channel, which is returning fully returning back to full production mode tonight, Sunday night. So yeah, I look forward to having a conversation. Good conversation.
Thank you, brother. And make sure to send that to me. I'll be happy to join y'all over there in the chat. Good to have that back. Always good to have that back. So let's go ahead and get started. The big tech scapegoat. So this article, I more or less claimed that the failures that we will explain later on in the show of Republican or conservative policies actually being blamed on things like big tech. I would even go further and say that not only is it being blamed on big tech, it's also being blamed on China. And one thing that I didn't clearly articulate, but it did just strike me now, is that it appears as if the case should be, instead of using big tech as a scapegoat for our problems, we should focus on breaking up big government. Well, wouldn't that be more sensible, Christian, than getting more government intervention into our economy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've always been on this side of the equation when it comes to the big tech issue. Because on one hand, I understand the frustration of people, including myself, who do use quote unquote big tech platforms to not only cultivate a living, but to also inject our sentiments to the public discourse. So many of us feel as if these platforms, given our hard work and the followings we have on them, owe us something. But on the other hand, what you have with a lot of these people who are calling for legislation, whether it be busting Section 230, which ironically also hurt the smaller competitors to big tech, or what have you, a lot of them presume that people have a moral right to be on these platforms, and that's just not correct. No one has a moral right to someone else's services. It's wrong when a progressive says it in terms of healthcare, and it's wrong when a person who is upset about big tech says it in terms of one of these platforms, Twitter, Facebook, what have you. So I think that what people need to do is what we can do is we can stop, because I do believe we give subsidies to some of these platforms. We can stop giving subsidies to all these platforms. That'd be wonderful. But we could also just allow people to do what they're going to do. You have Truth Social, which is having a very bumpy rollout so far coming out. You have Getter, you have Minds.com. You have all kind of places where you can go to get alternative viewpoints if you so want to. But interestingly enough, everyone who tends to do an exodus to those platforms always comes back to big tech. Big tech is only powerful because the consumers like it. And when something better comes along, these old platforms will go away and something newer will come into the equation. So I think that we ought to just let this thing play out as it will and not mistake inconvenience for a moral injustice. That's what I have to say.
Yeah, that's interesting, Christian, because I think a lot of what people are upset about in terms of big tech A lot of people are claiming that they're being censored when they're just sharing information with people who already agree with them. So I can understand not having the frustration of getting something like that removed, but if the consequence of that is somebody who already agrees with you isn't going to see that information once more, assuming that they probably already seen it from the 1,000 other friends that they have on Facebook, to what harm does that do? But moreover, I think people should really be concerned, and I've been investigating this about how such boogeymen are drummed up for the purposes of fundraising. Big tech, this mysterious Zucker man, I don't know. He's out there to get me. He's out there to censor me. He wants to control my life. Well, I don't think that's true. And people who buy into that are buying in unwittingly to the fundraising endeavors of politicians. And I think anybody should take a moment to step back and say, well, maybe it's not good to sponsor politicians' fundraising efforts. Like that's not. We'll say big political fundraising could be as much of a boogeyman as big tech, right, Christian?
Yeah, I think we've got two separate issues here, respectfully, though. We have politicians using hyperbole to fundraise, which is something that unfortunately they do in a lot of issues. And then we have people complaining about big tech and through incidentally being a party to a politician's fundraising efforts, right? I do think that there are serious concerns with how big tech, what have you, particularly websites like YouTube, rank certain types of content. YouTube has been caught shadow banning certain types of content creators who tend to hold a very different ideological position than what the CEO of YouTube and her friends hold. You've had people like Steven Crowder get monetized and remonetized, demonetized constantly Steven Crowder is a little bit of a fire starter, but for basically having a radical expression of different opinions. Now, in some cases, quote unquote, big tech has cracked down on more left-leaning causes as well. Louis Farrakhan was banned by Facebook and YouTube and all those places, and he's definitely not on the right. You had another group banned by Facebook. I forgot what it was a year or so ago. It was definitely like a left-wing Black nationalist group. So they're not just solely coming after the right, but mostly they tend to be. Now, it should probably go without saying that the two most popular pages on Facebook are Dan Bongino's and Ben Shapiro's. So obviously, there's some censorship, but it's not to the extent that conservatives can't operate on these platforms. That's where I would disagree. But there is a problem, and it should be addressed.
I think people should address this mutually reinforcing bad incentives, right? Where what Shapiro and Bongino will do is they will criticize big tech in order to get more views and to raise their profile. And then big tech will come after them and maybe do something to demonetize one of their videos. So it creates a mutual hostility, in which case only those two people or only those two groups or parties really benefit. And I think that's another issue with this alleged big tech discussion, is that it's all fear driven, and people who get a slice of the pie are people, big creators like Shapiro and Bongino, YouTube, and then politicians to fundraise. And then meanwhile, in terms of the quality of discourse, because we've focused on this nonsense concept that perhaps doesn't exist, we've thereby made things that much worse. And instead of talking about actual issues, we're talking about fake, perhaps not fake, but ideas that lack substance. That certainly should be integrated into the big tech conversation, right?
Sure. So I think there is hyperbole and exaggeration and a one-sided, if you want to say, anti-value creation in terms of what the big tech debate does. Just recycling the value between the big creators and the tech platforms, right? Because obviously the tech platforms get more notoriety than they already have right now, and they have these debates, and also they get more plaudits from people on the left. A lot of those kind of people who actually want to censor and deplatform people because of the words as violence philosophy. So yeah, I agree with you entirely on that. But I do think there are serious issues with how big tech treats some creators, right? Um,
Sure.
and 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 that should be addressed not by the government, definitely, but by these tech companies themselves. I think it goes too far when you have members of Congress calling Zuckerberg and formerly Jack, who was the former CEO of Twitter, before congressional committees, questioning them about their company decisions. That's not what I'm advocating for whatsoever. That's a circus. That's just a show. It's a show that really does nothing but embarrass these tech CEOs and make them even more resentful, right? So yeah, I think I can get on with what you're saying.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It benefits those, but I also think that in terms of thinking about how to deal with this most strategically and most effectively, what people are overlooking is the ability to be entrepreneurial. Where now you don't necessarily have to go to those things, but if you use a little peer-to-peer salesmanship, you could start your own blog, and on your own blog or newsletter, you could post anything you wanted. You could have a million memes of Joe Biden falling down the stairs, or million memes of whatever inflammatory thing that you wanted, and it would go directly to people's inbox, such that you would know if they received it or not. And I think really what so much of the discussion is doing is only further facilitating this idea of dependency, where things are always continuously outside of our control. And that's not really becoming for a republic. A republic in capitalism, and the whole ideas in which America has developed from, was on the basis of entrepreneurship, the basis of I'm able to create value, and therefore I ought to get reimbursed for that. It wasn't that Locke's natural law theory wasn't that, oh well, the king is oppressing me, this is unjust, how do I overcome that? It was actually a little bit more substantial, where it says, well, no, we all have these rights, and we cultivate our skills and abilities, and reap the rewards and merits thereof. And I think that this scapegoating idea in general is taking us down the path of dependency, or perhaps uh, reinstating that, or reinforcing that.
Yes, yes. I don't disagree with anything you said. We shouldn't. I don't think this issue should be scapegoated per se. But again, I do think there are legitimate criticisms that can be made about how tech companies regulate their platforms and relationship to certain kinds of opinions that they like or they don't like. That's a real issue. And we can have those substantial criticisms without necessarily doing what other folks are doing, putting them, bringing these people before committees, talking about how conservatives are oppressed and censored, talking about how these big tech companies, control the discourse. It's not that they control the discourse per se. And there's just been this analogy, this false construction of the public square created by some to justify regulation. Well, it's not a public square. I liken big tech to, let's say, a series of apartment complexes that are all privately owned and privately managed, that are nice and that people willingly decide to live in, as opposed to going and living in some of the other places they could live in, right? I liken the other tech platforms that are much smaller to being like rinky-dink efficiencies that have like one room in them, that people can rent out, but they don't want to because it's not as big, it's not as developed, it's not as well maintained as the very neat apartment complexes. But in either case, you're getting a privately managed, in many cases, a entrepreneurially started venture that you have no right to demand anything of. So it's not that's the public square, it's that the discourse has gone there, but the discourse, as is seen throughout history, can go to many places. The discourse in America started on a soapbox in the middle of the street. Then it went into halls to debate political issues. Then it went into government buildings. Then it went back into the streets. Then it's jumped so many places. Then it went into the newspapers for a long while. Then it went into TV. Now it's kind of gone online, and on YouTube and on TikTok. And so the discourse has developed over the history of this country and has had many different faces, but no one person and no few companies own the discourse. The discourse, in a sense, drives those companies. And you're right, that's a very empowering thought. Because when people realize that, it's no longer, woe is me, big tech is oppressing me. It's no, we have decided to give these companies the legitimacy they have, the cultural importance they have. And guess what? Individuals have the ability to take their discourse elsewhere, but most people don't. Hence, we're stuck with these companies. How do you handle that? I think that's pretty obvious.
Well, right. And if people wanted to, as you mentioned, you can take the discourse to the people. There's nothing stopping anybody today from printing out a handbill, such as what they used to do in times past, printing it up, drafting it up, and then going around door to door to talk to people. Actually, I found in a slightly different context, but perhaps still applicable, that people actually prefer that more. And most people are happy that I'm there to talk to them about whatever political issue it is that I'm talking about, because what I'm doing is I'm building connection with people and creating value in ways that they didn't have before. And there may be a greater market need and thirst for that than what there ever was in the past. I'm sure, for example, if somebody printed up a list of people and they had addresses and they were articulate, they wanted to get their points across, they could go door to door with flyers about their own thing and get them to subscribe to their channel. And I think that door to door tactic, given the lack of human interaction that we have now, would indeed be successful. And there's nothing stopping anybody from bringing back the old school salesmanship techniques that I would even argue we may need today. So that's, I guess, where we'll leave the big tech scapegoat and transition over to our second of three stories today, and we'll talk about why there was only three as opposed to five, about politicians, disgust, and great men. And what I'm trying to point to in the big tech scapegoat continues on here in this piece, where a certain contempt for politics and politicians is turning away great men from doing great deeds. And the two examples that I point to in this piece are Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan, both of which had they passed away at a given time. If Abraham Lincoln would have passed away after he lost his Senate race, or Ronald Reagan would have passed away after he was a spokesman for GE, there would be no way that you would ever know who these people are. Ronald, you can say he was a movie star, but he actually starred in 50 forgettable films. It's not mentioned on Rotten Tomatoes. It's not mentioned on anything. Like, he wasn't that great of an actor. I mean, let's just be honest about it, and that's okay. But what I'm trying to highlight here is that politics provides the opportunity for ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And I think the example of Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan highlights that, such that if we don't even believe in the possibility of greatness, how are we going to produce great men? Doesn't make any sense, Christian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I agree with your general point. Although it's unfortunate that politics has such a status in our culture that it, it has become a standard of greatness for some people. Politics shouldn't be that important. It shouldn't be that important that it brings you to admire someone for being a political leader. If politics were in its original if politics was excuse me, if politics was executed as it was meant to be executed, since the conception of the Constitution, politics would actually be a very non-important part of American life. But the other side is that you do get a chance to see some of the leadership qualities that politics does require come out in people, and it doesn't just affect government. It impacts entire movements and ideologies. I mean, how many times do you hear Lincoln and Reagan's name invoked? Right? I think you hear Reagan invoked much more than Lincoln. You hear Lincoln invoked more in certain contexts, particularly when people are trying to say the Republican Party is the party of minorities. Lincoln is always invoked, but Reagan is definitely invoked as a sort of status symbol for Republicans to measure up to. Although I've not seen that as much after Trump. Interestingly enough, maybe that's temporary suspension of that invocation, or maybe it's permanent. I don't know. We'll see in the 2024 election primary season. So yeah, I think I agree with a lot of your point, but
Well, I think
okay.
No, it's all good. Forgive me. I just think that we're really missing out on the opportunity to develop the sort of political leadership that we need by always talking about politics in a disparaging fashion, where we either bring up some issue that we oppose, or we bring up people that we oppose, but rarely ever do we look back with a sense of gratitude that I would argue that we should perhaps have, and honor, that I think Hamilton and Madison would agree is essential to good government, and really take that in. And I think because of that, future Reagans and future Lincolns are going away. They're going to something else, and then as a result, we're getting arguably worse politicians than what we ever had before. And I think anybody listening right now would agree that a younger, perhaps more sensible person than what it is that we have now as our president would be much preferable, right? It would be a lot better. I don't think there's anybody who wants to see somebody who's Biden's age hobble on stage and just make a fool of himself. He just embarrasses himself unwittingly. And if we better respected the perhaps art and science of politics, we would never have to see this gerontocracy exist. We could totally do away with that, right? Or do you think, Christian, that the gerontocracy, the rule by geriatrics, is the great thing, and that's what we should kind of aspire to?
No, never said that. Never said that. Although I don't think someone's age should be a disqualifying factor if they have their mental faculties in check, right? President Trump, for all of my criticisms of him, his mental faculties didn't appear to be deteriorating. I mean, I have a lot of criticisms of President Trump, but he was in his right mind. I know that much, at least in terms of his ability to perform. Maybe not always in his decisions, but in terms of ability to perform. So sure. I don't think age just should be a disqualifying factor as long as you know what's going on. I don't think Biden really knows what's going on, but even if he didn't know what was going on and he was making good decisions, I'd be fine with him. The problem is he doesn't know what's going on, strike one, he's making bad decisions, strike two. So I think the second thing matters much more than the first thing. But I want to see, I want to see fresher faces. But I want those fresher faces to have good ideas. I don't care if they're young. I care if they have good ideas or not. And I think politics is actually becoming somewhat of a commodity amongst people. There are a lot of people who get involved in political media, which can sometimes lead to political candidacy or politics itself, political candidacy, because they want the notoriety and the fame that necessarily comes with it. This is why you're seeing the quote unquote rise of what are called grifters. They do exist. I don't think they exist as much people think they do, but they do definitely exist. And they do it because they want fame. So I don't think that we're discouraging a culture of people from engaging in politics. We're discouraging the right kind of politics. I would agree with you on that one.
Correct.
And that's a problem. I agree with you.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm trying to point to here, is that perhaps instead of disparaging politics, we could encourage it in order to bring the right people on for the right reasons. And instead, because we speak so lowly of politics itself, we end up with a party rule by geriatrics and anonymous donors. And I don't know if that's what the founders had in mind, to think that all our political decisions had to be made by anonymous men hiding in these ginormous mansions somewhere in a gated place, in these almost 80-year-old people calling the shots. I think anybody, it's not that it's the age, I guess it's so discouraging. It's the lack of vitality. It's the lack of enthusiasm. It's the lack of inspiration, I think, sometimes that you get when you insist that people have to be 75 plus to get involved. Right? Like that's not going to encourage the next generation to pick up the responsibilities they need to facilitate the healthy development and running of a republic, right?
I think the best leaders are not ones who are trained to be leaders before they have the desire to. There are people who seek to cultivate the qualities of leadership after they've made the decision that they want to be a leader. Leadership qualities are something discovered, not instilled. I strongly believe that, because not everyone has them. And not everyone can have them either. There are some people who are just naturally not leaders. They don't have the fire in their belly. They don't have the strategic mind. Some people are better working behind the scenes or in the background. And guess what? We need both types of people. We need the people who are able to be the workers and people who are able to be the leaders. If we didn't have the workers, leaders really have a very hard time leading anything. If we didn't have leaders, the workers have a very hard time having direction in terms of whatever context they're working in. So, we shouldn't be trying to instill leadership in everybody. We should be trying to, if there's people who have those qualities, let's help bring them out. I would agree with that. Let's help bring them out. But
would you say that we should have ambition to counteract ambition? Or
what did you say?
Do you think that we should, as a famous person once said, do you think that we should have more ambition in politics to counteract ambition?
I think the fact that we have ambition in politics in the first place is a problem. Serious problem. Yeah, politically ambitious people tend to promise a lot of things to people, and those promises tend to turn into government programs to take more of my freedom away. So
yeah, I just asked because Madison says that one of the foundational ideas of our republic is that ambition ought to be made to counteract ambition. And so what my thought here is, in part with this piece, is that if we can encourage more young people to get involved, we can have more ambition to counteract the bad ambition of other people. Where if we have fewer people involved in any meaningful way, then people will turn to despots, perhaps like people we have in office now, who support mandates that would affect 100 million people at least, right?
Wildly unpopular.
Perhaps if we had a youth injection to make things more competitive and therefore contested, therefore maybe it would be no such mandatory mandates, dictatorial mandates would exist, right?
I mean, have you seen the political orientation of the youth these days? College students are more leftist than they have been in generations. Like, seriously. I don't know if having more youth would be the solution. I think having the right kind of ambition with the right kind of values would absolutely be the correct thing. Problem is, those people are going to be hard to find, because a lot of college students these days, a lot of young Gen Zers, Gen Zers are overwhelmingly leftist. Almost every poll is showing it. And it scares me. And that scares me. Because if this generation growing up, my generation, I'm 21, most people in my generation are leftists. If this generation ends up getting into power and keeps their beliefs, now beliefs can change over time, sure, but keeps their current belief system, we're going to see more dictatorship. We're going to see more socialism. We're going to see more erosion of America's foundational principles. And that worries me.
Oh, yeah, but I think it's also argued that most of today's young people that people are calling leftists are not that ambitious. Is that right?
I don't know. A lot of them are out there protesting, standing on top of cars, saying Black Lives Matter, excluding people from their friend group because they don't have a certain political orientation they want them to. A lot of them are ambitious, just in the wrong direction.
Well, I don't know if destroying things is perhaps ambitious.
Not destroying things, but a lot of them are involved in the political process in some way, shape, or form. I mean, Capitol Hill, as you know, is ran by young folks.
Yes, that is true. I think though, if we took ambition, I guess we'll say, has a societal value, and therefore people ought to be encouraged to pursue it, which to be clear, amongst those in progressive circles, ambition is not highlighted. It's not it's not a virtue. In fact, that's why you have books against meritocracy. You have famous professors writing books like that 24/7 to instill some kind of passive victimology that really stops more people from becoming more ambitious. Yes,
Right.
there are certainly some, but I think if we can mobilize enough people to make things even more competitive, we'll say a more competitive market in the political marketplace, that we would not only have better politicians, or perhaps, forgive me, more virtuous politicians. We would more healthily engage people for the right reasons, as a inducement to continue to draw out the right political talent to do the right thing.
I think ambition is encouraged amongst progressives. Achievement, or at least the kind of achievement that has built America, is definitely not. Achievement based on entrepreneurship and capitalism definitely is not encouraged. Ambition is, which is why you have this idea that is popular amongst academics these days about training students to be activists while they're still in the classroom. That's quite ambitious. Wanting students to go ahead while they're still learning, to go ahead and take these values you've given them and go ahead and change the world. That's pretty damn ambitious to me. It's just not ambitious in the right direction.
It's ambitious of perhaps the professors, but to encourage somebody to be a pawn in your game and for somebody else to ascend to that means that to some degree you are indeed forfeiting your own ambition in the name of whatever it is that somebody else is saying that you should or shouldn't do. In fact, even just becoming an activist, I don't think is at least a I guess we'll say, sign holding activist. I don't think anybody necessarily thinks that that's that ambitious per se. And I don't think anybody thinks that that's really changing the world in the way that we'll say a Lincoln or Reagan did.
Well, you understand, not everyone's going to be Lincoln or Reagan, Zygmunt. Those were two very special, unique men with very unique skills.
Yes.
And guess what? I think being an activist does have a degree of ambition to it, even if I disagree with what they're doing. I mean, Jane Goodall, she's basically been an activist her entire life. I don't really agree with her on a lot of things, but I would say she's quite ambitious. David Hogg, I don't agree with him on a lot of things. I think that he's politically infantile, but he's quite ambitious. So I'm not
discouraging activists. In fact, I used to be one prior to the position that I'm in now. I think activism is great, and it may be an essential tool in further developing or refining leadership traits. But what I'm saying is, if people have like a more grand conception, we'll say, of what they could be, if they hope to aspire to be somebody like Lincoln or Reagan, then maybe you would draw out better qualities or characteristics than people who don't aspire to be anybody that's profoundly changing things, but are looking to capitalize financially off of public sentiment, off of grifters, so to say, that are both in the political class and journalist class. I think that's what I'm trying to get at here, is that if people saw politics as an opportunity to do good, there would be a greater inducement for people to do good and less of an inducement to only seek money and power.
The question is politics the best conduit of doing good? That's a question for another show.
No, I mean, not if nobody believes that it is.
No, it's not a matter of belief. It's not simply a matter of belief, Zygmunt. I think belief can change how I interact with something, but there are essential qualities of politics that make it a little bit antithetical to doing good, whatever that might even mean.
Sure.
The fact, I mean, no, here's what I think we agree.
Yeah.
If we were to cultivate better mindsets about political engagement in the minds of the youth, perhaps we could have people who can counter some of the bad mentalities of those in power. My objection is that, number one, I don't think phrasing that in terms of men who were incredibly unique, like Reagan or Lincoln, is all that helpful, because I want people to first identify and find within themselves what they're gifted and they're skilled at. Lincoln was a gifted orator, one of the greatest orators in the history of this country. Reagan was not a gifted orator whatsoever. He was not a gifted intellect. He was a gifted, he could convert the messages of conservatism to the common man. When it came to debating these ideas, like, he would debate Buckley sometimes, he admitted it, that was not his strong suit. Lincoln debated all the time. He had no problem defending the values he stood for. Both men had their own sets of skills. They both identified them and they used them. If we're going to use Lincoln or Reagan as an example, Use them in that way. Identify what you can do to contribute to the political discourse. Not everyone's going to be a Lincoln or Reagan. Not everyone wants to be Lincoln or Reagan. Not everyone can be Lincoln or Reagan. And I don't think that cultivating a better mindset about politics is necessarily going to bring that out in people if they don't already have it in themselves. So that leads us back to square one. We have to encourage self-understanding first before anything comes after that.
And we will perhaps debate this topic at a later point. I think it's interesting, perhaps even fascinating discussion where I guess what I'm really trying to suggest is that to be great, you have to believe that greatness exists, where so many people do not believe that greatness exists, and therefore chooses to do, or they choose to do other things. And I think that's important. I think people could be a little more optimistic, and that optimism, to some degree, whether or not optimism is warranted or not, in some ways doesn't always matter, because just the optimism in and of itself can create a placebo effect, or perhaps a self-fulfilling prophecy where you're more likely to do well. And I think it's the likeliness that to a high degree is indeed substantial. But all this is to say that there is a deficiency in how people think about politics in and of itself, in part because of the old ideas of the past. And what I suggest in the third article for this week, a new fusionism, is that conservatism had not conserved any tradition, mainly because its outlook was too narrow in the sorts of things that it was talking about. So compared to progressive ideology, which is a lot more vast and much more sophisticated in the literature than what I think people initially suggest, that it just wasn't going to attract enough people. Likewise, Austrian economics, or as I say, capitalist theorizing, which perhaps is entirely correct by academic standards, didn't help advance capitalism or conserve anything either, because it's not a full enough worldview. And so I'm saying that the philosophical narrowness of both old school conservatism and Austrian economics made them less appealing overall to those who possessed a more comprehensive worldview, like what's shaped in Marx, Hegel, and Dewey. Regardless of whatever you think about the merits of those ideas, I don't think that you can deny that they are indeed comprehensive. And so this led to the overshadowing of both doing business, capitalism, and America's philosophical tradition, federalism. And I'm suggesting that a return to federalism, as it's described in The Federalist, written by Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, along with a better understanding of capitalism, a fusion between federalism and capitalism, could create more of a winning worldview that would return state sovereignty back and allow more people to do business. Christian, what are your thoughts on that new kind of fusionism? And would you say it makes sense as a political program, or that we ought to weep and go back to our Marxist handbooks?
You like these dichotomies, man. You like them. Oh God, man. Okay, now, but in all seriousness, yeah, I was thinking of a few things when you were mentioning everything you just mentioned. Just one quick thing about Marxism being comprehensive. I think Marxism seems comprehensive because it's a narrative of history, right? Or a predictive narrative of history. But in terms of ethics, what I've noticed is that Marx can never really tell us why it's right or wrong. It's very descriptive. And then Marxists take the descriptive nature of Marxism and they extract sort of, if you want to say, normative claims about right and wrong from them, right? But it's really descriptive. So I'm not entirely sure Marxism is as comprehensive as possible. But yes, that's just one thing I wanted to throw out there. I could be wrong, but one thing I wanted to throw out there.
You're right.
But no, I think Fusionism was initially an alliance of convenience, right? An alliance of two ideologically and close proximal camps in the American tradition, which eventually became conservatism in the 60s, that wanted to beat back communism and those kind of ideas. But I take the opinion of Frank Meyer, who's one of my big intellectual inspirations, who really saw libertarianism as being the sort of original form of American conservatism, as endemic to the American conservative project, because you can't have American conservatism without having something to conserve, and that being the Constitution and the principle of the Constitution, which, at least in its original form, would lead to a more libertarian society than not. I think, however, there are folks in the fusionist scheme that definitely didn't take that view to its logical conclusion, like Meyer did, and who definitely who saw more of a paternalistic role for the government and its actions in society. Some of the stricter constitutional conservatives did. Even someone like Bill Buckley these days would be castigated by the post-liberal right, which is the part of the right that's trying to shed fusionism that is openly said. I mean, Claremont, I forgot what the publication is called, but Claremont's publication quite literally said the Constitution is no longer enough. We have to leave that behind. So you have an entire section of the right which would revolt against people like Bill Buckley and Frank Meyer, who more represented more classical liberal beliefs. So I do think that we probably do need to update fusionism, because I'm personally a fusionist. I'm not sure if you are, Zigmund, but I'm personally, sure. I consider myself a conservatarian of sorts. And I think that any libertarianism has the political answers. Its foundations also have the moral answers, right? Am I making sense? Right? Because the foundation
that's clear.
of libertarianism.
What I'm really trying to highlight here, one thing that I would add on to what it is that you would say is that a focus on federalism, I think, needs to also be included in the preservation of people's rights as any comprehensive political ideology, if we insist on having one. That was overlooked, such that it allowed big government to take over. And what I'm saying is indeed factually true. The passage of the 17th Amendment largely happened because in the 17th Amendment is where the senators, instead of being elected by the state legislators, are elected through a popular election. The reason why that was ratified, and it did indeed take a while for that to happen, but the reason why it happened was quite literally the people debating it had no concept of federalism at that time. Truthfully,
I get it.
That's what it says in the work by Ralph Rawson that I just ordered. It's really awesome and worth looking at. But all that was forgotten. Whereas if that ideology would have existed or been explored or thought about in the 20th century, we may not have seen the vast expansion of the state. That's what federalism was designed to protect against. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, Christian. Where do you think federalism would fit in with these ideas of natural rights? We'll say the capitalist economics of Austrian theory and just other things that are generally considered important philosophically.
So federalism is simply a matter of designation. Where do the just powers bequeathed by the governed go? What are the limitations and who uses them? I don't think the fusionist tradition, correct me if I'm wrong, the original one, ever rejected or did not emphasize federalism. I've heard states' rights arguments used by a lot of quote-unquote fusionists. Buckley used states' rights arguments in a lot of his work. So I don't think, if you're arguing that federalism should be more emphasized in this new version of fusionism, fine. It never was like not treated as important. But sure, that's fine. But I think we got bigger fish to fry, though, because federalism is a matter of designation, whereas we have people asking the question um, if designation should even go to anyone except governments that want to enact quote unquote matters of virtue. This is what the post liberals of Romuald Amin would say.
Sure.
So we have to answer those fundamental questions first before deciding where power is designated to. In my opinion.
Right, and so part of the reason I'm saying what I'm saying is all the post liberal individuals are probably ideologically related to Kirk to a high degree. In fact, they're not
100%.
post liberal at all, at least not in my mind. They're conservatism too, which before didn't conserve anything because it was too narrow, because it had a too great of a focus on the Christian aspect of society, which didn't need to be conserved because it was already doing a good enough job of conserving itself anyhow. And that if we wanted to conserve America's original tradition, have state sovereignty and being able to do business, that a greater explicit emphasis on the idea of federalism be brought out, or to be taken more seriously. Because in my review of the literature in the past, I don't even think that that it was as big of a component as I think that it should be. I think part of any Republican platform, for example, should include the repeal of the 17th Amendment. Then that ought to go fundamentally. Okay. But that argument was hardly being made in the last 100 years. In fact, a lot of these guys who were deemed conservative actually used to be progressives. Kirk himself may have been,
like Max Eastman. Yeah. A lot of people who wrote for National Review at the first and jump-started the Fusionist movement definitely used to be socialist. A lot of them were and others were actually part of the old right, which were definitely not socialists. I mean, the old right was basically the prototypical stuff of modern day American conservatism. Let's have no mistake. The righteous anger towards the New Deal and government intrusion into private life eventually translated into Cold War sentiment, eventually translated into American conservatism. That's basically, part of how that came to be, as you know.
Yes. Yeah, so I don't think that it was explicitly emphasized enough. Now, I guess even in my own exposition of what a new fusionism would look like, I don't mention as many things as I indeed should. As you mentioned, there should be some understanding of natural rights to go along with federalism and Austrian economics, and I think together those forces would be much stronger in beating back communism, socialism, and the administrative state, in which now more Republicans or conservatives are backing and supporting, right? So, and I'll say this about so-called post liberalism. These are just folks who, instead of being against the administrative state, are now for it, just for different means than what progressives are. So that's by no means, that's not post-liberal. Actually, that's exactly liberal. That's exactly what Hegel's advocated for. So they're not doing anything new. Post appears to mean afterwards. They're not doing anything new or novel in that regard. They're just reinstating what was once considered progressive.
Well, I think by post-liberal they mean classical liberalism. In fact, that's exactly what they mean. Actually, they're a post-Enlightenment liberalism. That's exactly what they mean.
Well, yes, correct. So post-Enlightenment means something different than post-liberal. Those are two different words, but I'm not trying to quibble here. Just merely suggesting that much of what they're suggesting isn't post anything. It's actually pre. We'll say pre-liberal.
Sure, it is. It's medieval. It's really a lot of it's really medieval.
That's pre-liberal. That's not post anything. You're not coming after it. So they're fundamentally wrong on that point, and a lot of this is exposed by C. Bradley Thompson, who mentions most of the people who mentored him were in this pre-liberal mindset, this medieval theological mindset. But I will say, Christian, just to start to wrap this up, because I know that you got to go here in a minute. I think that a greater emphasis on natural rights, capitalist economics, and federalism would create a more complete and informed worldview that would be capable of, we'll say, combating the progressive administrative state, post-liberal administrative state agenda. And I think
I agree.
that combination of ideas, that's the only way that we undo those things.
I agree entirely. 100%. I agree.
So that's indeed what it is that I am working on. And Christian, feel free to hop off at any point in time. There were only 3 articles this week, which mean that we had to jump in a little bit more than normal, because I had this idea, well, I'm going to take 2 days a week to try to write for another publication. Well, as it turns out, I just said, well, I'm going to go to bed early instead of doing my work. So I did not indeed do that. So next week we're coming back out with the full set of 5 articles. If I never get in front of a larger, newer audience, I don't care, because I work for the satisfaction of myself and what I think is right, and not for publication. I guess I don't care, and it doesn't matter to me. And if that's how it has to be, and I don't get recognized for anything, but at least a few people were entertained or learned something, I guess that's all that matters. So that's where that is. As far as other news items that I listed in our end of the week commentary on the week in review section at zigmundereichenbach.com. Don't forget to go to zigmundereichenbach.com and subscribe to the newsletter if you haven't, and also go all the way down to the Patreon, make a donation so we can reach more people, not have to waste time trying to sell our articles to people we don't know. I mentioned Congress's reliance on what's called a continuing resolution, or what Congress is currently doing. Instead of actually dealing with the budget process as it should be, they are indeed just relying on a stopgap funding measure that's actually costly. And what should alarm anybody about this is that Congress, in continuing with these continuing resolutions, has not been able to implement any of the funds that were in Biden's so-called infrastructure spending plan. So you had all this great effort made about a infrastructure plan, and we need infrastructure, and we need this, and we need that. But the folks in government had no way to make sure that they would be able to implement that plan to start with, right? So, and that's all Congress has been able to do for the last few weeks, is avoid a catastrophe, a budget catastrophe, by settling for a minor disaster and not being able to implement the infrastructure agenda that they said was so important. So we have a vast number of politicians out there wasting our time because they're not being honest about the process. In fact, this is one reason why infrastructure shouldn't be done federally, because we could do it at the state level without having to do all these budget gimmicks to then implement our infrastructure plans. And that's how debauched the situation has become, where we have to turn to these national big government figures instead of handling these things right in our backyard. So that's the news update for the day. And if you happen to talk to those in the US Congress, tell them to support a bill that would make sure that if they don't get the budgets done on time, that they can't go home. That's the only thing that will make sure that these people are doing the work. Otherwise, they'll continue to pass these continual resolutions that delay the implementation of things that they voted on and come at a greater cost to us as taxpayers. These guys have to stay and do serious work. Anybody should be fed up with the fact that they cannot do a budget. They're unwilling to do a budget, that the incentives aren't there for them to do the right thing in the budget. So get at your folks in Congress, tell them to support a bill that would guarantee, if they did not get their work done, that they have to stay, because otherwise they shouldn't be going home. They shouldn't be taking advantage of the people by doing a bang up job on the budget and then going home to hang out and nap and whatever. So, and that legislation is called, it's just been introduced by Senator James Langford. So if you haven't seen that, it's called the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act. We want to make sure that people are paying attention to the Prevent Government Shutdowns Act. And maybe that'll provide a more meaningful stick for these people to get the jobs done. In the future, the next articles we will be releasing is the silver lining of the Biden the silver lining of the Biden presidency, the forgotten federalism in the 17th Amendment, in the equal branches of government, not according to the founders. They didn't believe that all branches were indeed created equal. That was a modern construct. In fact, they believed that the legislator should indeed necessarily predominate. Boy, how far things have changed since then. Well, that's all we have for today's show. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Make sure to visit ZigmundReichenbach.com for full access of all the articles that we're covering here. Meantime, I will